He did not shout. He did not weep. He did not even raise his eyes when he said it. But the moment the words left his lips, the Vatican changed. In a private chamber, shielded from cameras and cardinals, Pope Leo XIV summoned the one man no one thought would ever be silenced, Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle. Their meeting was not scheduled. Their conversation was not documented. But what followed, echoed through every marble corridor of the Apostolic Palace. The guard at the door crossed himself twice. The secretary, who had served 5 popes, forgot how to speak. And across Rome, a whisper began, one word, over and over again, why? Why remove the one who embodied compassion? Why exile the voice that millions called the heart of the Church? And why, now? They said it was just a conversation. But in the spiritual halls of power, silence is never just silence. It is verdict. It is veiled war. It is prophecy wrapped in protocol. And what Pope Leo said that day, without anger, without haste, left even the Swiss guard breathless. This is not a story of scandal. This is the moment mercy met its mirror, and the reflection was judged. Tell us, where are you watching from? And do you believe this removal was a righteous call, or a warning in disguise? If you believe the Church should still answer to God before politics, then you already know what to do. Subscribe to Faith Hidden Stories. But if you won't, drop your reason in the comments. What truth are you secretly hoping isn't true? Pope Leo XIV had once walked barefoot through the slums of Buenos Aires. Not for cameras. Not for charity reports. But because leather separated him from the dust that Jesus walked on. He rose not through ambition, but contradiction, the cardinal who preferred silence over speeches, bread over banquets, and prayers whispered in hospital corridors over applause in Vatican halls. When he was elected, some said he would be the Pope of the poor. Others whispered, he will be the last reformer before the storm. But no one imagined he would be the storm itself. Now, seated under dim lamplight, he waited. Not behind a desk, but beside a crucifix, with his fingers quietly circling a rosary that hadn't left his pocket since the night he prayed beside a dying child in Syria. Across the room stood Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle, the man known by millions as the Smiling Shepherd. He had been the hope of Asia. His voice, gentle, poetic, always laced with the language of mercy, had turned him into a spiritual icon. Wherever he went, people wept. Politicians listened. Bishops leaned in. But so did the cameras. And eventually, so did the critics. They said he was the heart of the Church. But some, inside these very walls, began to murmur, when the heart beats too loudly, does the body lose its balance? Lately, Tagle's sermons had grown more inclusive. His language, more political. His tone, more defiant. He'd embraced conversations that others avoided, same-sex unions. Interfaith worship. Cultural relativism. He didn't declare doctrine. But he didn't defend it either. And Pope Leo XIV, who believed silence was a sacred weapon, had said nothing. Until now. The setting was deceptively simple. A private audience chamber. Velvet curtains drawn. No cardinals. No press. No notes. Just a pope, a cross, and a man who used to be his closest spiritual son. But what happened in that silence would echo louder than any homily. It would divide bishops. It would rattle seminaries. And it would send a signal, soft but final, that the age of balancing both truth and applause was over. Because in this room, only one voice would leave unchanged. If you still believe humility and truth, not fear, should lead the Church, then this story is your altar. Subscribe now to Faith Hidden Stories. But if you won't, what stops you? Is it doubt? Discomfort? Be honest in the comments. No judgment. Just light in dark corners. There were no introductions. No handshakes. No, welcome, my son. Only a quiet pause, and then, do you still believe your voice serves the people, or your vision? Pope Leo's words didn't rise above a whisper. But in that silence, it was as if every statue in the Vatican leaned in. Cardinal Tagle didn't flinch. He offered a practiced smile, the kind honed from years at press briefings and charity galas. A shepherd, he said gently, walks among his sheep. Not above them. Not behind them. Leo nodded, as if acknowledging an old parable revisited. But there was no warmth in his eyes, only gravity. He asked again, more pointedly now, and when the path splits, between doctrine and compassion, which staff do you carry? The room held its breath. Tagle's reply came soft but swift. One carved from love. Truth without love wounds. Love without truth, it withers. But together, they heal. It was beautiful. Balanced. Even bishop-worthy. But Leo did not blink. Because behind that answer, was a dodge. Not a lie. But a veil. He shifted forward, elbows on the armrest, the rosary still circling through his fingers. You met with the Luxembourg delegation last month, Leo said calmly. You spoke of evolving definitions of family. Why? Tagle folded his hands. Because the world is bleeding. And people, especially the young, no longer hear our voice. We must speak a language they recognize. Leo's voice didn't change. But should the church translate, or transform? Again, Tagle offered poetry. We must become bridge builders. Leo's response was a silence thicker than stone. Bridges, he said, are only holy when they lead to the altar. Otherwise, they're escape routes. And still, Tagle did not retreat. He praised the growing interfaith dialogue. He defended open communion as acts of pastoral mercy. He spoke of Christ's embrace, not his rebuke. Of belonging, not boundaries. And for every soft answer, Leo offered no rebuttal. Just another question. What do you see when you look at Peter's keys? An invitation, or a warning? It was then that Tagle's expression shifted, only slightly. Gone was the smile. In its place, guardedness. Calculation. Maybe, fear. Because this was no longer dialogue. It was confession without a priest. And Leo? He was not here to debate. He was here to discern. The questions kept coming, quiet, calm, relentless. Each one not seeking information, but intention. These were not queries. They were weights. And with each one, Leo was testing something unseen, not theology. Not rhetoric. But alignment. Was Tagle still walking in the same direction, or had he veered, quietly, under the banner of mercy? If this tension reminds you of the battles between truth and popularity today, you're not alone. Subscribe to Faith Hidden Stories, because silence won't save us anymore. And if you're still unsure, then speak. What questions are you afraid to ask in your own faith community? The comment box is open, for courage. The shift was nearly imperceptible. A subtle change in Leo's posture. A pause in the rosary's rhythm. And then, a question sharpened like flint. Why did you tell the Filipino delegation, he asked, that the church must adjust to modern families? Tagle didn't flinch. He met the Pope's gaze, eyes steady, too steady. Because love adjusts, he said calmly. Truth listens. But the room changed. The air thickened. The crucifix above them seemed heavier. And Leo's voice dropped to a whisper that felt like thunder. Love doesn't dilute truth, it carries it. Then came the tremors, not of rage, but revelation. Leo reached for a folder. Not thick, but weighty. Inside, speeches, transcripts, letters never intended for public eyes. He read, almost gently, a line from one of Tagle's recent homilies: the Church must walk with the wounded, even if it means leaving some walls behind. Then another: we must rethink the moral absolutes that have silenced too many hearts. And finally, a sermon preached to youth in Jakarta, a full 30 minutes. Not one mention of sin. But the word progress, 15 times. Leo closed the folder without looking up. Then said quietly, progress is not a virtue. It is a direction. And not every road leads home. There was no reply. Not because Tagle lacked words, he had always had words. But because something had shifted. The Pope was not interrogating. He was unveiling. The tension was no longer philosophical. It was personal. A clash of priesthoods, one ancient, one evolving. Leo recounted a moment from his time in South Sudan. A child had been brought to the mission tent, scarred from war, shaking from trauma. The local priests had argued. Should she be baptized immediately, or wait for catechism? Leo said nothing. He knelt beside her, held her hand, and whispered the creed. Then he turned to Tagle, eyes sharp: mercy does not require delay. But neither does it demand erasure. You speak of love. I ask, where is its backbone? Still. Tagle did not rise. He did not raise his voice. But the warmth had gone. The shepherd was now the diplomat. He responded, people are leaving, Holy Father. The pews are emptying. If we do not bend, we may break. Leo nodded once. Then replied, not in anger, but in ache, or perhaps, we are meant to be broken. So that Christ, not comfort, remains. And in that moment it was clear, this was no longer a disagreement. This was a mercy divide. A fault line between two visions of salvation. One rooted in eternal law. The other, in human longing. And only one would hold. If you've ever wrestled between compassion and conviction, between staying silent or standing alone, then this story is not just for you, it's about you. Subscribe now to Faith Hidden Stories. Or speak honestly in the comments, is it mercy, or compromise? What line are we crossing, and why does no one want to say it aloud? Then came the moment. Pope Leo, who had spoken gently, who had listened longer than most men breathe, reached into the folds of his cassock and withdrew a letter, creased at the edges, held too many times, read more than once. He placed it on the table between them. Carefully. Deliberately. Like a relic on an altar. You endorse this? He asked, no malice, no accusation. Just wait. And sorrow. Tagle glanced at the page. He knew it by heart. It was a policy draft, circulated quietly among select bishops and advisors. Its aim? To reconsider the pastoral tone toward couples living together outside sacramental marriage. To replace phrases like living in sin with in-progress companionship. To encourage a journey of inclusion before correction. He had not written it. But he had not rebuked it. He had signed it with 3 words, worthy of discussion. His reply now was measured, I endorsed listening, not approving. Pope Leo stood. Not in fury, but in grief. And the air shifted. Then listen to this silence, he said. It's the sound of a church confused. He didn't look at Tagle when he spoke next. He looked at the crucifix. And what he said, cut like incense through a tomb, I buried a boy in Manila. He was 13. His mother begged him to come back to Massachusetts. He told her, why bother? Even the church doesn't believe what it used to. 3 weeks later, he took his life. Tagle's lips parted, but no words came. Leo went on. His mother came to me. She said she had stopped praying. Not out of anger, but confusion. I don't know what we believe anymore, she told me. And I don't think the priests do either. He turned then, slowly, back to Tagle. Not in confrontation, but in lament. You think silence protects the broken. But ambiguity breaks them further. A pause. We are not called to be windsocks. We are watchmen. The Pope sat again, his face weary now. Older than his years. As though bearing not just the sins of the Church, but its fractures. And for the first time in that chamber, Tagle lowered his eyes. Not in shame. But in tension. In that ancient ache between what he wanted to believe, and what had just been shown to him. Because here, in this quiet confrontation, the question had shifted. No longer, how do we reach the world? But, at what cost? And the room, thick with memory and marble and meaning, held its breath. Because something had broken. Not a man. Not a movement. But the illusion, that both paths could be walked in one direction. If this shook you even a little, if the silence in your soul has ever sounded like confusion, then subscribe to Faith Hidden Stories. Don't just consume stories. Be convicted by them. Or comment below, have you felt that silence? The one that whispers, even God isn't sure anymore. Say it. Release it. Leo didn't raise his voice. He didn't clench his fists or slam the table. He simply looked across the distance, no longer between two chairs, but between two gospels. You mistake invitation for inclusion, he said, slowly. The gospel invites, but it also transforms. His words were not loud. But they landed like a bell rung deep in the marrow. You preach open arms, he added. But when did we stop asking people to kneel? Silence. A thick, suffocating silence. Not from awkwardness. But from revelation. Even the guards, trained to stare straight ahead, shifted. One crossed himself. Another blinked hard, as if holding something back. Tagle's lips parted. But no words came. Because how do you reply to a sentence that carries the weight of Calvary? Leo stood again, not as an accuser, but as a man grieving something sacred that had been slowly, subtly, replaced. You want the Church to be safe, he continued. But it was never meant to be safe. It was meant to be true. He walked to the window. Rain touched the glass, soft, steady, like tears without sound. Beyond it, Rome pulsed with life. Tourists snapped photos. Streetlights glowed gold. But inside, something ancient was unraveling. Leo turned back, his voice now low and cutting. Not cruel, but precise. You see the wounds of the world, and you want to bandage them with comfort. But comfort without repentance is not healing. It's decay wearing perfume. He paced slowly, the crucifix above them casting its long shadow across the floor. You confuse kindness with surrender. But Christ did not hang on that cross to become a symbol of softness. He hung there to divide flesh from spirit. To call sin what it is. To call man back to God. Tagle sat still. But his eyes had changed. There was no longer defense. Only a quiet unraveling. Not of belief, but of certainty. Leo stopped walking. He looked once more at the letter on the table. Do you know what frightens me most? He said. It's not that you love people too much. It's that you fear they won't love the Church, unless the Church lowers its voice. Then he whispered, not to Tagle, but to the silence, if the trumpet gives an uncertain sound, who will prepare for battle? He returned to his seat. And in that moment, without decree, without declaration, something snapped. The final thread. Not with anger. But with a holy finality. If you believe truth must still pierce hearts, if you believe the gospel was never meant to be rebranded, but revealed, subscribe to Faith Hidden Stories now. If you can't, then explain in the comments. Which part of this truth unsettled your comfort? Which sentence left you trembling? Pope Leo turned toward the window again, not to gaze, but to breathe. The rain had slowed. The rooftops of Rome shimmered like washed stone. And for a long moment, he said nothing. Then, barely above a whisper, he spoke. This isn't about Tagle, a pause, filled with memory. It's about what we're afraid to lose, souls, or seats. His back remained to the room, as though confessing to the city itself. We talk about inclusion, he continued, but we forget, he included Judas, and still called sin, sin. He stepped away from the glass. The light caught the folds of his robe like folds of parchment. Everything about him, in that moment, looked aged, not from time, but from burden. There are wounds that fester under silence, he said, and wounds that heal under truth. We've confused which is which. He didn't end with a ruling. He didn't declare excommunication or exile. He simply reached for the crucifix on the wall, the same one he had kissed the night of his election, and placed a hand against it. And then, he prayed. Not like a pope. Like a father. For those we failed to guide, his voice trembled slightly. For those we failed to warn, a beat of stillness. And for those, we chose not to offend, at the cost of the gospel. There was no anger left in the room. No victory. Only clarity, clear as crystal in cold water. This was never about policy. Or progress. Or public perception. It was about the soul of the Church, and the soul of every person who had ever looked to it for truth, and found only echoes. He turned back once more to the man before him. Tagle had not spoken for minutes. Not out of defiance. But recognition. A son, hearing his father say what no son ever wants to hear, you've been loved. But you've also been wrong. And there, in that aching silence, Leo offered no punishment. Only that most dangerous mercy of all, the chance, to choose again. If you've ever stayed quiet when truth needed a voice, if you've ever traded conviction for comfort, then this is your wake-up call. Subscribe to Faith Hidden Stories. Or speak in the comments, who are we most afraid to offend, God, or the world? The chamber would be cleaned. The letters filed. The decision, unspoken, yet unmistakable, would ripple outward like incense in a cold cathedral. There would be no press release. No signature stamped in red. No thunderclap of authority. Just the silence of understanding, and the slow turning of spiritual tides. Outside, the bells of St. Peter's struck once. Then again. Not to announce removal. But to mark a moment only heaven could truly measure. And now, the question leaves the marble and settles into your bones. If you were Pope Leo, would you have removed him? Could you have looked into the eyes of a beloved son and said, mercy without repentance is not mercy, it's surrender? And if you were Cardinal Tagle, would you have spoken differently? Would you have drawn the line sooner? Or did you believe, as so many do now, that love must first be understood, before it dares to correct? Ask yourself, not in theory, but in trembling truth, what would you have done? Not in a palace. But in your parenting, your silence at work, your Sunday pew, your scrolling thumb. Because every day, we face the same altar, truth, or tolerance. Conviction, or applause. And so many of us, without even knowing, have become quiet bishops of our own compromise. May we all seek truth with humble hearts, and never mistake applause for approval. May we remember that mercy without clarity is not love, it is abandonment. And may we dare, in a world addicted to echo, to be a voice that still trembles at the cross. Subscribe to Faith Hidden Stories, not for headlines, but for heartache that reveals heaven. Still won't? Then write your reason. What truth in this story made you hesitate? What sentence made your heart stop, because it was too close to your own?